So that gives you a sense of what Lyari looks like on the right, and Hyperstar has been bought out by Carrefour, so that's a picture of Carrefour. But you know what these big department stores look like. I know you have them in Sri Lanka as well. Saddaf talked about the way that she managed her body as she moved through the city. One of the greatest advantages of her job was its pick and drop service, which reduced her stress greatly in a context in which the crowded and infrequent buses were a bane for most of the women living in her neighborhood. And particularly as her shift ended at 11 p.m., when it's generally considered unacceptable for a young woman to be traveling unaccompanied in the city. However, the journey from Lyari to Clifton, where her job was, also involved her shifting her habitus as she moved between the two contexts. Saddaf described the careful calculation of her bodily conduct throughout her commute to maintain an image of respectability, which also ensured that she could keep going to work. In Lyari, Saddaf wore an abaya, or I'm sure most of you know what an abaya is, kind of a burqa, over her uniform, which she said all young women her age wore in order to be considered respectable. However, when she got to Clifton, she took off her abaya, as according to her, people over there thought it looked odd. Wearing an abaya might have marked her as working class in a context where she is pressurized to appear upwardly mobile and modern. And vice versa, not wearing it might make it seem like she was showing off amongst her neighbors and relatives who were already resentful of the fact that she was earning so much more than most of them. When Saddaf returned to her neighborhood late at night, she would avoid the main road and opt for smaller side streets or gullies so as not to attract the prying eyes of the men hanging out on the street and the loose talk of her neighbors. While I'm not romanticizing the kind of service sector work that Saddaf was part of, which is also in many ways exploitative and does not fully comply with the conditions of decent work, for Saddaf, her relatively well-paying job at the multinational department store with its pick and drop service had opened up a set of opportunities for her that were otherwise unavailable to most of the women living in her neighborhood. This provided her a space of relative freedom and opportunity for upward social mobility as compared to most of the other women living in her locality. At the same time, while Saddaf was freed from the transport-related pressures that most working-class women in Karachi have to face, she faced a great deal of stress and anxiety when she returned to her neighborhood due to the criticism she received for returning late at night and for working in a profession that was seen as dishonorable because it involved frequent contact with ghair mard, or unrelated men, and dressing in a more Western or modern style. The tactics Saddaf adopted, from changing her dress to altering her roots, helped her maintain her respectability as she navigated a variety of spatial contexts. If she didn't do this, she risked being an outcast either in her community or in her workplace. And she also risked having to leave her job altogether if the pressure on herself and her family became too great. Her ability to travel in the city and to work in a place like Hyperstar were hence constantly under threat. In fact, at the time I interviewed her, Saddaf was engaged to be married, and her fiancé and in-laws had already told her that she would not be allowed to work after she got married. For this reason, work outside the home, of course. For this reason, Saddaf was trying to delay her wedding for as long as possible. Saddaf's story illustrates just how difficult it is for women, particularly those from the working classes, or perhaps more aptly, the precarious classes or the precariat, to engage in decent work. Her case study helps us understand some of the reasons why the female labor force participation rate in Pakistan is so low, despite increasing education levels, and why, when women do engage in paid labor, it is most often restricted to low-paid, insecure jobs, largely in the informal sector. While my talk focuses on Pakistan, similar trends can be observed across South Asia and indeed across the global South more generally. So at just about 24%, Pakistan has one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the world and even in the region. While the rate increased steadily from 1990, when it was just 11%, to 2015, when it reached 24%, this growth has stagnated over the past decade, with significant dips during the COVID-19 pandemic, as was experienced everywhere. Similar trends have been observed across the region, as Professor Ghosh's talk also outlined. This is despite the fact that education rates for women and girls have been steadily increasing in the country and indeed across the region, with women in Pakistan born after 1990 receiving approximately double the years of schooling as compared to women born before 1965, and with women comprising slightly more than half of those enrolled in higher education in the country. Clearly, education on its own is not enough to increase female labor force participation. We also know that out of the 24% of women who are engaged in paid employment, the vast majority are concentrated at the lowest rungs of the employment ladder, confined to precarious, feminized forms of work in the informal economy, including domestic labor, low-paid teaching jobs, and home-based work. So what is preventing women from accessing decent work? And I'm talking largely about urban contexts in my talk, which is where most of my research has been done. So just to say decent work, according to the ILO, I know the word decent is very loaded, at least in Pakistan, probably across South Asia, and tied to morality. But decent in this context means fair wages, safe and healthy working conditions, job security, social protection, and opportunities for career development. That's the ILO's definition. So one of the main issues is restrictions on mobility. As Saddaf's story illustrates, one of the main challenges women face to accessing decent employment are restrictions on their mobility. These restrictions come from a variety of sources, including their own families, their husbands and in-laws if they're married, their community and neighbors, along with the constant fears of sexual harassment when they venture outside. While practices of parda vary between communities, or veiling, there is an overarching belief that a woman's rightful place is within the home. If a woman must leave the house, she should be properly covered, and she should avoid contact as much as possible with unrelated men. Much of this stems from ideas of honor, or izzat, which again vary between communities, but generally tie the family and community's reputation to the conduct and control of women's bodies. As Saddaf's story illustrates, women must engage in constant and exhausting calculations in order to maintain their izzat and the izzat of their families and communities. Women are also deemed as unrespectable. Women who are deemed as unrespectable risk social censure, which could lead to further restrictions on their movements and even, in many cases, violence. Restrictions on women's mobility often increase during times of conflict, when group boundaries are tightened as a result of insecurity. In conflicts around the world, women's bodies have become markers of the community's identity, and I know you know that all too well here in Sri Lanka, across South Asia. This is true across religious and ethnic groups, as we saw so clearly even during the genocide in Gaza, which is ongoing, where Palestinian women's lingerie was proudly displayed by Israeli soldiers as a marker of their victory. But it is particularly true in South Asia, and we've seen this. I don't have to go through all the examples, we have too many. Hence, while there are some exceptions to this rule, women's mobility, and hence their ability to engage in decent work, tends to decrease during conflict to protect them from being defiled by men of the other community. Similarly, members of marginalized religious and ethnic groups often place tighter controls on women's mobility due to their collective insecurity. This is something I've written about in relation to Indian Muslims, but similar patterns are apparent in marginalized communities across the region, including in Pakistan, including, I'm sure, in Sri Lanka. In general, safety and security are commonly used as excuses to tighten patriarchal control. Similar patterns can be observed amongst migrant communities, whether these communities have migrated due to conflict or because of environmental and economic pressures. In my research on Muslim women in Delhi, I found that those women who had recently migrated to the city often faced tighter restrictions on their mobility by their husbands and their in-laws due to heightened insecurity. A study published in 2019 by the Collective for Social Science Research in Karachi also found that women whose families had recently migrated were less likely to engage in paid employment outside the home due to moral panics about the bad environment, or the bura mahal, of the city, including the fear that they would mingle with men from other communities. Even in more settled communities, those whose families have been living in the city for generations, women's mobility is often restricted to their immediate locality, both because of patriarchal community and family restrictions, but also because of a lack of decent public transport, and the need to stay close to home to fulfill domestic responsibilities. For this reason, many of the women in Saddaf's neighborhood in Lyari worked in part-time domestic work in nearby localities, as teachers in low-cost private schools in their own neighborhoods, where their salaries range from between 1,500 to 3,000 rupees a month, which at the time was $10 to $20 a month, and these are often women who've actually completed university education, or extremely low-paying home-based work. So the impact of marriage. Another noteworthy part of Saddaf's story was related to her marriage. While some studies demonstrate that a woman's likelihood of engaging in paid employment increases after her marriage, in Pakistan, marriage seems to have the opposite effect. Studies conducted over the past 2 decades show that a woman is 7% less likely to participate in the paid labor force after marriage. In my own anecdotal experience, I would imagine the number is even higher. While ideas about izzat and honor are definitely part of the explanation, increased domestic responsibilities, particularly after childbirth, as well as the persistence of the male breadwinner model, along with discriminatory employment practices, are also likely part of the explanation. As we know very well, women carry out the vast bulk of unpaid domestic and care work in the world. And this is particularly true in South Asia, where the discrepancies in time spent on unpaid work between women and men are amongst the highest in the world. In Pakistan, it is reported that a woman spends 11 hours of unpaid labor for every 1 hour performed by a man. Many women cite domestic responsibilities, particularly after having children, as the main reason for leaving their jobs or not seeking employment outside of the home. If they do work outside the home, it's mostly part-time and in areas close to their residence, which limits the opportunities for accessing decent work if one lives in a low-income locality. Another important reason for women's low labor force participation, whether women never seek paid employment or whether they withdraw from work after marriage, is the male breadwinner model, or the idea that the man should financially support the family, while women are responsible for domestic and care work. This idea is still deeply entrenched, not only in the minds of men, but also in the minds of women, and in fact, might be getting stronger rather than weaker over time. A study that tracked attitudinal changes using the World Values Survey found that 70% of people, which includes women and men, born before 1970, believe that when jobs are scarce, men should have more rights to jobs than women. What is even more worrying is that this number went up to over 80% amongst those born since the late 1980s, indicating an increase in conservative beliefs around gender roles. Many women I interviewed for my research in Karachi also stated that they only worked out of majburi, or necessity, because their husbands were unemployed or didn't earn enough on their own to care for the family. Considering the kinds of employment women are most likely to be engaged in, the fact that they resent having to work outside the home is also not surprising. Patriarchal attitudes such as notions around izzat or the male breadwinner model are prevalent across genders. However, because men have more power generally, men's attitudes often have relatively more of an influence on women's agency than women's own attitudes do. For example, studies have shown that husbands' attitudes towards women working outside of the home have a greater influence on female labor force participation than do women's attitudes, which brings me to my next point, which is the need for men to change. Too often, discussions about women's empowerment and gender equality have focused almost exclusively on women, placing the burden to change largely on them. Perhaps one of the reasons many of our gender-related indicators have stagnated or even worsened over the last 2 decades is because women have changed as much as they can on their own. In order for gender equality to be fully realized, including the equal right to decent work, men will have to change too. There is an urgent need to start focusing on men and masculinities and on changing attitudes about gender roles more generally if we are able to push through the barriers blocking women's access to decent work. Underlying most of the reasons for women's low labor force participation and their lack of access to decent forms of work are patriarchal attitudes. These attitudes tie the community's honor to women's bodies. They reinforce rigid gender roles, arguing that men should be the ones who provide financial support, while women should be confined to unpaid roles within the home. They tell women that their primary means of fulfillment is through motherhood, and that they should withdraw from the workforce after marriage. They lead to discriminatory practices against women workers, who are viewed as less reliable because of their family commitments, and they also contribute to a lack of will amongst policymakers to provide women with the necessary support to be able to engage in decent forms of work, which includes providing affordable and safe public transport, childcare facilities, and maternal and paternal support so that both partners can be encouraged to share in household responsibilities. For this reason, it's imperative that attitudinal change be placed at the center of the agenda. This is perhaps one of the reasons that education alone is not enough to guarantee women's labor force participation. What is the content of the education being imparted? Are children being taught to question gender roles? Are girls being sent to school to become better wives and better mothers only? Are boys and men being taught that they too need to change? Of course, this is easier said than done. Cultural change is complicated, slow, and difficult, but it's also central to removing the barriers to women's empowerment. Apart from adding gender to school curricula, governments should engage in public education campaigns through the media and through community organizations to challenge conservative ideas around gender. Until and unless women and men's attitudes towards gender roles, including femininity and masculinity, start to change, women like Saddaf will continue to face barriers to accessing and maintaining decent forms of employment. That is, if they are allowed to work outside the home at all. Thank you.